Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hudson Institute. Welcome as well to those joining us virtually this morning. I'm Joel Scanlon, Executive Vice President of Hudson, and I have the privilege of introducing today's discussion and this distinguished panel. It is appropriate to be holding this conversation in the institutional home of Herman Kahn, a nuclear strategist who, frustrated by what he found to be conventional approaches and flawed policy, sought to help guide policymakers through the most difficult questions of the emergent nuclear age. How to effectively deter conflict, how to win the conflict if deterrence failed, how to survive the catastrophe of a nuclear war. We are now in a new nuclear age. Strategic adversaries are modernizing and expanding their arsenals. Technology has proliferated. The enemies of America and its allies are on the march, and global security is rapidly deteriorating. It was far past time to reevaluate the array of threats we face and American strategic forces, the bedrock of American deterrence. The 2022 National Defense Authorization Act established the bipartisan Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States to review U.S. nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure, and to conduct an assessment of America's adversaries. Earlier this month, the Commission released its final report on America's strategic posture, the first such report since 2009. Much has changed in the last 14 years. Commission Chair Madeline Creedon and Commissioners Gottemoeller, Robert Scher, and my esteemed Hudson colleagues, Rebeccah, Heinrichs, and Marshall Billingsley, are here to guide us through the Commission's findings. We look forward to hearing from these distinguished panelists. Commissioners, thank you for your public service. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that introduction. So we'll talk very briefly, but it is a report that contains 81 recommendations. So I'm sure we will not do it full justice today, but we'll at least try and touch on some of the highlights. I want to start by saying first, this report is threat-informed, it's forward-looking, it is nonpartisan, it is consensus, and we were all fully committed to our task and the goal of achieving consensus. So it provides high-level guidance to shape future decision-making and generally refrains from choosing specific systems. We provide characteristics of recommended capabilities, but we did not pick winners and losers, and I think that's very important. The time frame of our report is 2027, looking to at least 2035 and beyond. And when I talk about the threat informed, it's pretty clear. We all know that the threats from China and Russia are growing and they're different, and we have to be prepared to meet them both. The hopeful environment and the vision of widespread nuclear reductions from a decade ago, longer even, when the last strategic posture released their report, it's no longer realistic, and the prospects for agreements on nuclear arms control today sadly appear bleak. That said, there is no reason to stop pursuing broader risk reduction efforts when achievable and in the U.S. national interests. And if there are opportunities for arms control or other strategic stability talks, military-to-military talks, confidence-building measures, or other opportunities, they should all be explored. But today, the U.S. is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting for which we did not plan and we are not well prepared. We are facing two nuclear peers, and that is unprecedented. And so the nation must act now and with a sense of urgency that the Commission did not always see. Steps need to be taken, again now, to enable both near and longer-term decisions. It's essential that what the U.S. does now and in the next few years enable the flexibility that will be needed to reshape the conventional and nuclear force structure, and that we not foreclose options that might be needed in the future. There are 5 assumptions that underpin our report. Russia and China will continue their current respective adversarial paths, each growing the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. China will continue to grow its conventional forces, including its space and cyber capabilities, and Russia will also grow its space and cyber capabilities. Each will continue their aggressive foreign policies and seek to supplant the U.S.'s global leadership role. The second, today's one major war strategy construct is no longer viable, particularly given China's current trajectory. 3, the 6 foundational, long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear strategy remain valid. I won't go into all of them. We can talk about those later. Strong allies and partners are essential and make us all stronger together, but we need greater cooperation, coordination, and integration. And finally, the U.S. deterrent must be credible, and it must be seen that way by our adversaries as well as our allies and partners. In addition, the U.S. needs a whole-of-government approach to deter and prepare for the possibility of a two-theater conflict, even if one of the conflicts is opportunistic. The U.S. defense and nuclear strategy must be implemented to effectively deter and defeat, if deterrence fails, simultaneous aggression in two theaters. China can no longer be considered a lesser-included case for force structure planning, and nuclear and conventional force sizing and composition must reflect this new strategy. From a force structure perspective, the U.S. nuclear modernization program of record must be fully implemented as rapidly as possible to deter both Russia and China, but the program of record, although absolutely necessary, is not sufficient to address the projected threats. And as we look forward, the transition period between the legacy systems and the new modernized systems will be very difficult. It'll extend over the better part of a decade, even longer in the submarine force. And as a result, the U.S. must ensure that the legacy systems are sustained and funded so that the nuclear deterrent is safe, secure, reliable, and effective during transition. If Russia and China stay on their current trajectories, and nothing we saw would indicate a change, although of course the situation could improve, and we certainly hope that's the case, but we didn't see any indication of that. The composition of the force must change. Unfortunately, there is a growing risk of confrontation with China, Russia, or both, and that includes the risk of military conflict, including the possibility of nuclear use. So to deter and prevent nuclear conflict, the U.S. must increase its conventional forces, quantitatively and qualitatively, adopt a more resilient space architecture, modernize nuclear command and control, and advance integrated air and missile defense capabilities. The Commission notes that each theater is different geographically and will require different forces. Without more conventional forces to deter regional wars, the use of nuclear weapons regionally becomes more likely. And without significant conventional increases, the U.S. will need to rely more on nuclear weapons, increasing their role, not decreasing their role, as we have sought for years to achieve. While a large-scale conflict remains unlikely, the probability of regional deterrence failure is increasing. The U.S. needs a force posture capable of simultaneously deterring both Russia and China. And we also have to look to our industrial base. Much of the infrastructure and industrial base that supports the Department of Defense and the National Nuclear Security Administration is out of date, unusable, or in some cases literally falling down. And both departments are struggling with supply chain issues, and neither have enough capacity to meet future requirements. Investment in infrastructure and rebuilding the supply chain and the workforce is needed urgently and will be needed in perpetuity. This is true for both the NNSA production and scientific infrastructure, which we cannot ignore. We cannot ignore the scientific side of it, although we tend to focus mostly on the production side, as well as the DoD industrial base. All need work and attention. And finally, I would like to highlight the report's findings and recommendations on risk reduction. The Commission believes it is of paramount importance for the United States to work to reduce strategic risks. U.S. vital interests and international security are served by robust diplomatic engagements that reduce uncertainty and reduce the risk of deterrence failure and unnecessary arms competition. It's in the U.S. national interest to lead and to be recognized as leading diplomatic efforts to reduce risk. U.S. nonproliferation efforts and the nonproliferation regime have slowed the spread of nuclear weapons, and U.S. and allied threat reduction measures have successfully constrained the availability of nuclear materials, technology, and expertise to potential proliferators. So with that, I'll close, and just a thanks also. I should mention the Vice Chair, a former Senator from Arizona, John Kyle, who ably assisted in bringing together this team and this report. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marshall.
Thanks, Madeline. It's great to be with you. When we were appointed 12 commissioners appointed by the leadership of both the House and the Senate, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and it was not, I think, at all clear at the outset that we would arrive at these unanimous recommendations. So you had 12 commissioners from across the political spectrum, but you have one set of recommendations that are consensus-driven and with which we all agree. And I think the reason for that is that over the course of roughly 18 months, we received threat briefing after threat briefing. We received briefings from across the nuclear enterprise, from a wide range of other adjacent areas. We had input from allies, which we greatly appreciated, input from the NATO international staff. And we drew together as a group because the conclusions that we reached, the findings, lead you to the inescapable conclusions that we've made and therefore the recommendations that we've drawn forward. I would highlight for you 4 areas to look at. As the chairwoman has indicated, we now must make modifications to both our strategic nuclear forces and our theater nuclear forces, and these modifications are urgently necessary. That word urgent you will find throughout the report, and it is quite conscious. It is manifest in so many aspects of what we are dealing with. It's reflected, this sense of urgency is reflected both because of the velocity of the threat that we face in terms of China and its strategic breakout, the fact that Russia continues to add to its nuclear arsenal, and so on and so forth. It's also required because of the sorry state of affairs in which we find much of our deterrent force and the seeming lack of appreciation for urgency in many of the other areas, such as in the conventional space. As the chairwoman has said, the Chinese threat in particular cannot anymore be just a lesser included case within the Russian threat. And that results in the need to both deter and achieve our objectives against Russia and China simultaneously if necessary. And so you'll find on page 48 really the heart of the recommendations we make with regard to the nuclear deterrent. And what you'll see is that we call for preparations to be prepared to upload our hedge warheads if necessary, to plan to deploy the Sentinel missile, which is the follow-on to the Minuteman III, in a MIRVed configuration in multiple warheads, to increase the planned number of the long-range standoff cruise missile, the nuclear-tipped cruise missile, increase in the number of B-21 bombers and the associated tankers. As Madeline said, we don't specify numbers, but we do very specifically urge an increase in quantity in these cases. We also feel that the currently planned number of Columbia-class submarines is insufficient and that we will need to both increase planned production as well as a third shipyard in order to accomplish that. We also urge that we begin to examine, again, the possibility of a road mobile ICBM. We further, on the theater side, urge that we address the need for theater nuclear weapons in the Asia-Pacific region. And we identify a number of characteristics that would be advantageous for theater nuclear capabilities that we currently don't possess. The second aspect of our recommendations that I would call your attention to center around missile defense, and there are many recommendations, and I know Rebeccah will want to speak to this too, I'm sure. But one of the most important recommendations we make is a change in approach, and that we need to field missile defenses that are able to defend the American people from coercive threat by either Russia or China or anyone else, which is a landmark change. The section on allies is something that I hope all of you will read through. For me, the most important thing is that we unequivocally repudiate the neo-isolationism that has crept into political discourse of late, and that we stress that our alliances are both essential, but they're also beneficial for the United States. Now, we don't propose to give our allies a free ride, and we do very specifically call on allies to increase their defense spending to meet their pledges and their obligations, but we do underscore the fact that the world order that the United States has established with our allies, which is what Russia and China are attempting to undo. The preservation of that is vital. Finally then, a little pet rock of mine that I would highlight for you is the fact that for the first time this commission pulled into the deterrent framework the use of financial and economic tradecraft. And we call upon the President to establish a whole-of-government approach to the use of financial and economic tools. And we ask that the Department of Defense, which far better than any other element of the United States government is able to do detailed planning, to assist the other departments and agencies that possess and use those tools, like the Treasury Department, like the State Department, like the Commerce Department, to help them with an integrated effects-based planning process so that we can hopefully better employ these tools in advance of a conflict to deter escalation. So again, many, many thanks. It was a great pleasure and an honor to serve on this commission and with longtime colleagues. Rose?
Thank you, Marshall. Indeed, it was a pleasure and honor to serve. I will give great credit to our chair and our vice chair who isn't present today, John Kyle, because at the outset they said to us, you will work toward consensus, we will work toward consensus, and you will be courteous to each other. And so we were. And I think our discussion this morning attests to the fact that we have truly a bipartisan group here. By the way, yes, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, but also 6 women and 6 men, which I welcomed very much indeed. And I was delighted to be working with Madeline Creedon, an old friend and colleague, but also a very capable chair of this commission. So I would like to, first of all, foot stomp a couple of things. And I'm going to begin with what Marshall had to say about allies and partners, the exceptional role that we really recognize with regard to our alliance relationships and their importance overall to the security of the United States of America. And I think we all fully agreed with this emphasis that Marshall placed on really pushing back against a kind of neo-isolationist strand in U.S. foreign policy. And I know Senator Kyle, if he were here today, would emphasize that point very much as well. So I wanted to foot stomp that to begin with. And the second thing I wanted to foot stomp was of the 3 necessary changes to U.S. strategy that we highlight. Madeline's been through them already, but I wanted to really emphasize this one. The United States and its allies and partners must field sufficient conventional forces to effectively deter and defeat simultaneous Russian and Chinese aggression in Europe and Asia. Without adequate conventional forces, the United States would need to increase reliance on nuclear weapons to deter or counter opportunistic or collaborative aggression in the theater. In some audiences or in some settings, this is being read as somehow that this commission is embracing nuclear warfighting, and in particular is embracing the notion that the United States should have an escalate to de-escalate strategy. I think this is total nonsense, and I want to draw a line under this. We clearly express here, as a commission, a preference to continue to focus on our conventional force posture. Yes, we spent a lot of time talking about nuclear force posture in the report, but we also focused on the need to build up our conventional capabilities as well, so we would not need to rely on nuclear weapons to deter or counter collaborative aggression in either theater. And so I think that point somehow in recent days is getting lost in certain settings, and I really wanted to emphasize that because it's very important. Marshall's already talked about building up the tanker force, for example, and we do emphasize the necessity of certain conventional capabilities being built up. The tanker force is one aspect of it. I think Rebeccah will be talking about integrated air and missile defense, but there are a number of areas where the Commission overall felt that we needed to be focusing on conventional forces as well. The other point I'd like to make in my remarks, and I agree with what Marshall and Madeline have already said, but the other point I'd like to really emphasize for you is there is a certain sense of phasing in the report that is also getting lost a bit. We recognize this period between now and 2027, which is, that was we are responsible for really focusing on 2027 to 2035. Again, that was our tasking from the NDAA. But this period is vital because we are beginning to accelerate our nuclear triad modernization at this moment, but we recognized very much the difficulty of the transition from the legacy forces to the modernized triad forces, and the necessity of keeping a full focus during this period on the efficacy of that transition and making sure that it happened. Because as we write in the report, there are no margins here. We are up against the schedule in terms of replacing our ICBM force, for example, on a timely basis. So we really urge a firm focus in this period on keeping the pace up, and if necessary, making some adjustments to the strategic forces. So frankly, we can keep up to the levels of the New START Treaty, the limitations of the New START Treaty, deploying 700 delivery vehicles. And in order to do that, we may have to take some steps because of the ICBM force being, as old as it is, and some ICBMs perhaps having to go out of deployment. So all of that is in the report. That's the first phase. The longer phase then is out until 2035. And again, Madeline already referred to the fact that our triad modernization is going to stretch at least till 2035 for some systems and into the 2040s for the SSBN force. So we have to look at that longer range as well, and to think about what the future may be. For me, I see, and the report recommends, that we pay attention to a future with or without arms control. For me, that means, yes, we may make planned changes now, but if the world changes and we are back at the negotiating table, then we will have opportunities to make changes in those plans in the distant future as we are approaching the mid-2030s into the 2040s. Because of the fact that all of those capabilities, like additional SSBNs, would not be built until the 2040s. So we are talking about a long-range planning situation here, and it's not necessary. We all recommend that it needs to be done, but those two phases, I think, are important to pay attention to in the report. With that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Well, as often happens, towards the end of the panel, you hear all the brilliant ideas of your fellow commissioners that you've worked with over the 18 months, and I feel as if everything I've written down is just going to be foot stomping some of the things that they said, but let's go for it anyway. So I do think, as I reread the report, sort of, you're in the midst of it, you don't really read it in sort of from beginning to end, you just sort of hit different points. But as I reread it, there are a number of things that sort of came out to me as if I were reading this for the first time, what would I want to highlight? One of them is, and I think we sometimes gloss over it, but that nobody is saying that today we are in a position that is problematic for deterrence against the threats that we see. Having said that, that wasn't our charge. Our charge is to look at the future, and if you look at the future and you look at the threats that are emerging, you can't help but come to the word of urgent action that we need to take now. So one of the things that we talk about is the current program of record. The current program of record has to be continued. No one is arguing that we make major modifications. It is something that was set. It is important. It is a foundation. Having said that, it was a program of record built upon a threat that we do not see in the future. So in order to say that the program of record is what we need for the future, I think is missing the point of what we see as the new threats. That's not a hit on any of us, and many of us were, almost all of us were involved in that at some point, defending that program of record. But the threats changed, and to hang on to the existing program of record in face of changed threats is not what you should be doing as a commission or as a strategy. So continue that, it's gotta be the foundation, but in fact, as Rose has said, the margin, we've traded on the margin of that and our advantage for many years, that margin is gone. We have to take actions today. As Madeline said, we tried to avoid specific answers, but look at capabilities. The 12 of us have been involved in different stages of all of this, but it wasn't for the 12 of us to sit around the table and decide what the Department of Defense, what the Department of Energy should be doing. What we did feel it was our charge is to lay out what we thought were the capabilities needed. And as the departments go and look for this, as the experts go further on, that was the key for us. And I think it was an important decision that the chair and vice chair and the commissioners all made to lay out those conditions, to lay out the capabilities, but to allow for some flexibility as both the threat emerges and as technology changes as we look into the future. These developing threats will definitely have to call for some different ways of thinking about some of the issues that we look at. Employment strategies should be out there and looking at that. How we view arms control. Not that we shouldn't do any of these, but frankly, we have to think, are there different ways to be looking at this? There are a number of things, however, that shouldn't change. Our overall approach to targeting, we make a big point about law, rule of law, warfare. We're not suddenly changing drastically how it is that we conduct and what the key pieces of a nuclear strategy are. We're also not changing, as everyone has emphasized, but it's a good point to emphasize, the role of allies and extended deterrence. So even as many things can change, many things have to remain the same. And I think I'd urge you as you're reading to look at where those differences are. Where are we looking and arguing you need to think creatively, and where are things that are pillars that we need to stand by? I think some of the really most interesting pieces to look at overall as you're reading through, industrial base and the support structures that the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense have. Access to technology, making sure the federal government can access some of the cutting edge technologies. I think there's some really important pieces in there. I think there's a new sort of a good turn on the space issue and how we look at space as part of that strategic posture. Integrated air and missile defense. I think it's now important that all of us look and say, Rebeccah will talk about that. But this was a vibrant discussion, if you will, within the commission. And I think, as Marshall pointed out, some changes that we look at. And regional capabilities, how we look at regions in terms of the integration of all of our elements of national defense. And throughout, again, foot stomping some pieces that people have said, I think I'd encourage everyone to look at urgency and creativity. There are actions we need to take today, to enable us to make choices tomorrow that we may choose to make. And if we don't take some of those actions today, a lot of them around the industrial base, the support structures, then we will have constrained the options for decision makers in the future to deal with future threats. And I think that's really, that's one of the key things to take away, urgency and creativity. And I will also note the bipartisanship. I think if you had looked around the table, or if we looked around the table and thought, oh, we'll come up with a consensus document, that'll be fine. That shouldn't be hard. 18 months ago, I think that would have been a nearly comical proposition. What I think is important is that it was a conscious choice. It didn't happen by accident. It was a conscious choice to find and develop areas of agreement. Look, this isn't the report any of us individually would have written, but I got to tell you, I think it's better as a result of that. Rebeccah.
That was great. Thank you all for being here. I will talk about missile defense for just a little bit. It was a privilege to serve on this commission. It really was. And I think one of the things that I did, I have never served on something like this before. And one of the things that I did throughout the entire time was I kept going back and reading the 2009 Commission report, just to check to see what were they thinking about. Are we thinking about those things? What did they miss? Are we going to miss those things? And I just kept going back and reading it. It's really remarkable for all of you, if you're looking for something to do this weekend, to really compare the 2009 Commission report and ours, and really kind of look to see some just really, really dramatic things that are different. One of them was, I just noted how optimistic those commissioners were about the direction of the threats facing the United States. Pretty optimistic. I mean, one of the points was that they made was their assumptions, but that the opportunities to further engage Russia and China is rising. And then just the time that we spent together looking at not just what our adversaries are investing in and the direction they're going, but how they're behaving. And we really spent a lot of time looking at that and thinking about that, and then listening to our allies come in and talk about what they're seeing our shared adversaries doing, and how uncomfortable they are. And so that to me really, really stands out. And we talk a lot about how that was all the way back in 2009, but it really wasn't that long ago, how quickly things have changed. And really at the time, to Bob's point about not being too hard on those who were putting together the commission, of course not being hard on them at all, that was the threat assessment, that was those were the assumptions they were dealing with. It was also the view of President Bush, W. Bush, President Obama. Though, if you look at their assumptions about the Russia threat and how they were thinking about it, it was very different. When President Bush withdrew the United States from the ABM treaty, he said part of his comfort in doing that was that the Russians were no longer posed the same kind of threat that the Soviets posed to the United States. That's what he said. And then Putin at the time even said, he was not happy about the United States pulling out of the ABM treaty, but he said it wasn't going to be a threat to Russia anyway. And so that was his remark at the time. And that was back in 2001, 2002. So lots have changed. The threat environment has just simply, it's very, very, very different. That my fellow commissioners have talked very, very well about how that China is engaged in the strategic breakout. The Russians are, we talked a lot about what they're doing in Ukraine. Okay, so it's funny, now the commission's done, I'll have people, did you think about Ukraine? Yes, we did. Just the question, did you think about this, that we really had to think about a lot, and then to try to think about the US strategic posture. But there's a lot of things that we thought about that didn't make its way into the report too, because we thought it still sort of went beyond the scope. But we did think about a lot of different things, and how Russia is using nuclear saber rattling in order to carry out its invasion, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. So we did think a lot about that. And then what that means for how the United States needs to think about continued threats from Russia, how China might be thinking about this, and what can we do to maintain the peace. So I do want to just mention, I think this is so important, and several of my colleagues have already mentioned this, but we really wanted this document to be something that the American people can read and make sense of. So we thought about several different audiences, the American people, yes, policymakers, to look at it. Whenever I briefed some Senate offices recently, I said, please share this with your comms team. This is for your comms team too, to look at to see how we talked about the stakes. So Marshall said that, that we all agreed that the US-led order is worth protecting. That's really important. We did not gloss over that, because if you talk about the US strategic posture, you have to think about what is it that we're even trying to do with it? What are we trying to do? And we see ourselves as defending the US-led order that we and our allies and partners, really everyone, as Rose has pointed out many times, have benefited from. The stability and just the order, the systems of alliances, the sovereignty of nations. And so we really tried to lay that out as clearly as we could in a way that would make sense. And then we moved on to how that's being threatened, and that we are in the business of trying to preserve the peace and to deter major power conflict. And as Rose pointed out, a big point that we all agreed on was it's been a goal for the United States to rely less on nuclear weapons in our defense strategy. But if that is to remain true, we've got to build out our conventional forces. There's no quick trick to solve the problem that we're in. And so some of it, it will be expensive, but if Frank were here, he would say, but not really if you consider, one, what it is we're trying to do, and then understanding we're not doing everything at once. And that some of this is now, but some of this is for planning for the future, to set ourselves up so in 3, 5, 10 years, decision makers have the option to do some of the things that we think they might have to do. If we want 300 B-21s, that's not going to be something that we can turn on in 3 to 5 years if we're not thinking about now for another production line. What do we need for more B-21s in 3 to 5 years than we have currently planned for right now that we have to be looking at in terms of supply chains? And that gets back to the defense industrial base. We've got to be thinking about workforce, supply chains. If we're not doing that, then really all of this is impossible, or very, very, very difficult to do. So that was also really important. So I guess I would just say, look at tone. Marshall was right on urgency. Same thing, we talked about urgency throughout. We tried not to overdo it. So if we're like, oh, this is urgent and this is urgent. Not everything can be urgent, but we try to be really careful about which things we were stressing. That this needs an adaptation now. This is something we need to look at. It's not headed in the right direction. And then again, to what Rose said, also understanding that I mean, the idea here is that we get into the minds of our adversaries, and so they decide not to go down this path continually. That's what we would hope would happen. And so though we don't have to do all of this at once, exercising some of these muscles now and moving in those directions, hopefully, would send a signal that we are not going to simply, over time, allow these adversaries to simply just change the status quo and change the rules of the road, which China's clearly trying to do today in this moment in the Pacific theater. So that's another piece. And then program of record, it's necessary, it's not sufficient. That's a big takeaway from the report. So we don't want to do anything that jeopardizes it. You know, sometimes people come in and they say, oh, look, we can do things, you know, cheaper in this way, and this is going to be important. It's like, we don't want to mess up the program of record. We want to keep that and make sure that stays on target to the best we can, but it's just not going to be sufficient for some of these other threats that we see coming and to be able to meet our deterrence objectives. To the chair's point about the tenets of deterrence, that's actually, it might seem like a really wonky point. It's very important that we did not decide to, we did not decide to you know, rethink about how the United States of America has been able to the extent that deterrence is one of those things where it's very hard to prove. It's just the absence of something happening. But we have not seen a nuclear employment since the Second World War. We'd like to keep it that way, and we don't want countries to think that they can begin redrawing borders by force. And so that's what we're trying to maintain. Deterrence has held, and so we didn't try to rethink how we're going to do deterrence, even though we can use different tools, and we're happy to use these other tools that we have available to us. We want to be able to do that. But what we're holding at risk, we're still holding at risk what the adversaries value most. The adversaries value, and we list them in the report, what they value, and that's going to be true. It's going to be different as it applies to China and Russia, but those categories are the same. And so that was important to us. And then also Marshall's point, I think, is really important about economics, statecraft, because that is a really interesting piece that helps buy us time. Buys us time. So Marshall can talk about how we would do these in particular crises, but even in the peacetime, where you're in the competition time and trying to steer your adversaries, there's some things that we can use and tools that we can use if we bring them into thinking about deterrence that can buy us time as the United States tries to seek to make ourselves better equipped to be able to handle these threats that are headed our way. I'll talk about missile defense for just the last minute, and then we'll turn it over for another bite at the apple before we hear from your questions. The missile defense piece is really important, and it's in the 60s pages, I think. It's important for a few different reasons. One, you can really, I would just encourage you to read General Van Herk's public testimony, NORTHCOM commander. We came to the conclusion that, one, it's still very important, U.S. policy, agreeing with previous administrations that we stay ahead of the North Korea missile threat for the U.S. homeland. That's really important. We're not giving up on that. We think that we need to continue to do that. The other piece of this, though, is really worried about the coercive threat from peers against the U.S. homeland. And sometimes people hear that for the first time, and that seems very alarming. And I would encourage you, this is, sometimes there's always a lonely general out saying the same thing over and over again. And General Van Herk has been talking quite a bit about the risk to the U.S. homeland. And he's been very clear that he believes the most acute threat right now to the U.S. homeland comes from Russia. He says it in his public testimony. I mean, and he explains what he means by that. And I would encourage you to go read exactly what he says and how he says it. But what we're worried about is the United States cannot project power abroad without the security of the U.S. homeland. And so as we think about what our adversaries are doing regionally and what they're trying to do, clearly Russia does not want the United States to help Ukraine more than we are. Doesn't want us to help us to the extent that we are. And so that's where a lot of the threats against us with nuclear weapons have come from. They want us to stop helping Ukraine. Well, we want to make sure that that's not something that our adversaries understand, that we not only have the will to come to the aid of our allies, but we have the ability to do that too. And so we just want to disabuse them of the notion that there's going to be any opportunity where they can hold at risk anything on the homeland that's going to cause us to think that we can't come to the aid of our allies. And so I just want to think that is a really important piece. We do not say how we're going to do it. We leave that to the engineers to think about what can be technologically feasible. We encourage them to go figure it out, but then look to deploy it. So this is not just sort of another task or a research project. We really do want want to take away that coercive threat, that vulnerability, so that our adversaries just know that that's not a path that they can step on and be successful. And so that was just really, really important, and really thankful. Just the whole entire report. I did the same thing. I mean, after it's published, and then I feel like I read it over and over and over again in the process of it being written, but then once it's done and you read it, I'm just very proud of it. I'm very thankful for the leadership of Madeline and John Kyle and all of my colleagues. It was really a privilege to serve. So with that, if I'll turn it back over to the chair. Anybody else who wants to add or say anything else?
Well, thanks. I think we pretty much covered everything. If there's maybe two things we sort of left out, and it's important, and it's people. That was one of the things that, as we had our discussions across the board with DoD, with the Department of Energy and NNSA, and it's all part of the industrial base, and it's people, and we need more people. We need more people at all levels, and scientists and engineers and trades and electricians and welders and everything, because you look at what we have going forward, and you look at what we need from a people capacity, and we just don't have them. And it's bigger than DoD, it's bigger than the Department of Energy, and this is really one of those whole of government types of things, and I know we talk about whole of government a lot, and sometimes we just sort of roll our eyes when we talk about whole of government because everybody always talks about it, but putting together a training program, putting together scholarships, really focusing on what unions used to do. They were very capable in terms of producing skills and crafts, and going back and really thinking about how to grow a workforce is just hugely essential. And then the only other thing I want to talk about is, we've had a lot of questions and a lot of comments about the report saying, oh, well, it's just unaffordable. It's a wish list of military things. How can we ever afford this? And there are a couple things. One is, it does focus on the nuclear, but it really focuses on the conventional. And yes, it is going to be expensive, and yes, we are going to have to spend money. But when you look at the percentage of the GDP that the defense budget is right now, and how much smaller it is now than where it's been historically, and if you really want to say, okay, well, we really are serious about deterrence, then we have to invest in our conventional forces, in our nuclear forces, and our infrastructure if we are going to maintain deterrence. Because we have a section in the report that really talks about the fact that war is more expensive than peace. And this is an important aspect of this. Part of the affordability is also bringing in new technologies and bringing them into the Defense Department and to the Department of Energy in a way that is faster and quicker, because there's a huge amount of capability in the private sector, but we need to figure out our procurement system so we can do it faster and integrate it faster and not fall all over ourselves as we go forward. So it is affordable if we are smarter about it, but it is also going to cost money.
No, I have nothing to add.
You've said your piece, okay.
Do you have?
I just have,
And I just wanted to mention one thing about integrated air and missile defense. One of the important aspects for me was the recognition that we really have to focus on the air breather threat. Cruise missiles, whether you're talking about conventional cruise missiles or you're talking about the new nuclear propelled cruise missiles that the Russians are developing and deploying. So when you look at that, section about integrated air and missile defense for both CONUS, but also for our allies and partners, you have only to look at the war in Ukraine to see how important these missile threats are right now. And the notion of the United States finally tackling this air breather threat against CONUS, to me, was very important. Bob?
I just have two things, and it's true. One of them is on missile defense as well. I think it really goes to, I use the word vibrant, discussion. Look, this is a section that I learned a lot through this process. And really, I think my own views changed a lot as we went through this. One of the things, though, that I think is important to make clear is no one's talking about going back to this Star Wars shield over everything, right? Please read the report. Read what coercive attacks mean, right? What we're trying to do is saying there's critical infrastructure. There are things that we would be worried that our adversaries might think with just a few attacks, a few air breathers, a few, even, dare I say, nuclear weapons, the United States would be deterred because we couldn't defend some critical assets. Look, if an adversary wants to launch a full-on barrage, that's a full-on scale war. We understand that. We feel we deter that and need to continue to deter that. But it's the coercive attacks, the smaller ones that we feel we are threatened by and vulnerable to. And by the way, if anybody says that, coercive attacks or, sort of localized integrated air and defense missile areas is destabilizing, I challenge you to go and try to figure out, why are our adversaries then, why do they have that? Why does Moscow have an incredible integrated air defense system around it, right? I'm unwilling to accept that it's destabilizing for us to be able to do the same thing. Similarly, a point that none of us made, but it was a question that was asked before and has been asked a lot, so I figured I'd get at it outside of, quote, prepared remarks, which is, isn't this just another arms race? Isn't that what you're doing? And I really feel strongly to push back on that, which is, look, we have had the same kind of a setup, program of record, for many years now. And we lived under appropriate arms control treaties and those levels for many years, as we wished everyone else would do. During that time, what did we see? We saw Russia looking to new and novel nuclear weapons. We saw China building up its arsenal and looking to continue to do this. So if what you're trying to avoid is an arms race, I would argue we as the United States were trying to do that. And then all the things that we were hoping to avoid actually ended up happening anyway. We're not the ones who are continuing this on. We are just taking a look at what the environment looks like and realizing that we are no longer in a position to say we can deter what we see the threats are out into the future. And I reject this argument that we are the ones that are doing this arms race.
Just to add that too, on the coercive threat piece, because the concern that we have, and it's the cruise missile threat, certainly, but that the Russians may believe, not even that they could threaten us with it, but potentially that if they were to strike in some sort of scoped fashion the targets on the United States, that it would paralyze us with fear, frankly, is the way. That it would not enrage, that it would make us fearful but not enraged, and that we would choose, if the reason they did that was because they're trying to redraw borders through force overseas against U.S. allies, that the United States, because we have our hands full here and everything going on here, that we might just say, oh my goodness, that's not worth the escalation, and then the United States steps back, and they can because they understand, the Russians understand that the United States is the backbone here of the alliance architecture, and so the United States has to be confident that we can confidently project power. And so what this does is, again, it's to bolster deterrence. And the last several missile defense reviews have talked about the importance of U.S. missile defense, not in this particular way, but missile defense in general, bolstering now the Trump and the Biden missile defense reviews, the importance of U.S. missile defense in bolstering the credibility of deterrence. We want to constantly try to have our adversaries doubt that they could be successful in something like this, so that they decide that, you know what, I'm going to doubt enough that I'm not going to go that way. And that's the idea of what we're trying to do here with taking away the attractiveness of that coercive threat. And to Bob's point, I've heard people say, then aren't they just going to, wouldn't they just attack a little bit more? That's going to be a different calculation on their part, right? If they're going to go even bigger than that, they're already making a different kind of calculation about how the United States and our allies might respond there. So it's that layer that we're really trying to get at. And then the other thing I would just say that I think is interesting, I haven't heard it brought up, is we do talk about, although I think it made its way in the report, how it would be good if the Chinese would stop testing FOBs. Okay, so
We go further than that.
FOBs, baby.
So the risk reduction section, like all the other recommendations, is consensus. And while it is, I think, fairly gloomy at the moment,
Deservedly so.
right, it does hold open the prospect for changes in the environment, possibly allowing for measures to be adopted. It is not it actually lays out several areas where we feel, very concrete areas, where we feel risk reduction measures, specific types of risk reduction measures, and or specific types of arms control efforts are warranted. And the fractional orbital bombardment system that China launched with a missile received a great deal of attention from us because it is a destabilizing, first strike, decapitation type weapon. And so we specifically call for a ban on the development and testing of ICBM-launched FOBs. So there are areas where the arms control community need to focus, need to work on. We agreed that we should continue to invest in science and technology related to verification, because if we are, as the report calls for and recognizes, if we're going to negotiate any future arrangement based on whatever our force requirements wind up being, it needs to cover all nuclear weapons. And in order to do that, you face enormous verification challenges to effectively verify limitations across the nuclear spectrum. That's just another example of an area where we very much agreed.
Okay, we'll move to Q&A now. If you respectfully will keep your questions brief, and please state your name and affiliation. We're willing to take questions now.
Hey, I'm Robbie Grammer, a reporter at Foreign Policy Magazine. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the $3.4 billion for submarines in Biden's emergency supplemental request, if that's something that goes toward rebuilding the submarine industrial base that you were talking about, if it makes any impact, if it's a step in the right direction or everything we need or not enough, something like that. And secondly, just wondering, given there is this prospect of Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state, if they take that next step and break out, how that alters any sort of posture that you have here, while taking into account that Russia and China are obviously the biggest threats. Thanks.
I'll take the submarine question. So the difficulty we have is, as we've talked about, the margin in all of our modernization efforts is evaporating. And that is very much the case with regard to the Columbia class, which is why we actually went so far as to recommend refurbishment or reactivation or construction of another submarine shipyard. We also recommend or take note of the fact and recommend that the Ohio-class submarines will need to be extended longer than originally planned. So the funding that the administration has requested is quite important, but in and of itself, that will not be sufficient for where we need to go. As an aside, and this is not in the report, but in the event that we find it necessary to begin to put in SSGNs into the production line, I'm not sure we've really thought that through and what the knock-on effects would be to the boomer production. So the submarine force got a lot of attention, and it's not in a good place right now.
And I guess I would add on the industrial base, it is a good move. I think it's very consistent with the report, but we also talk a little bit, it really is the larger submarine industrial base. It's not just the Columbia class, but it's also the Virginia class submarines that at the moment are also way behind schedule. The other piece of that supplemental appropriation request that I think is really interesting, and again, consistent with the report, and it's the whole of government approach. And there is a request for some funding in there for the International Monetary Fund to be able to counter some of the Belt and Road sort of initiatives, and I think that's also a really good whole of government approach. I mean, to me, that's a a pretty smart move is, to look, we can do this. I mean, we have the ability to confront these problems, to deal with all of our problems in a whole of government approach. We don't, I mean, obviously we're the Commission on the Strategic Posture. Our charter was out of the NDAA, so our focus was very much in that respect. But we recognize to be effective, it's got to be much more, and which is why we touched on the economic statecraft and the sanctions, but there's a whole lot more of it. And so that I think was really good too.
Question on Iran. If you will look at the threat section, we do address both Iran and North Korea in the threat section, but just as you said, much smaller than the Russian Federation and China. I would say, and here I'll reflect again on what's already been said about the non-proliferation regime and our very firm as an entire commission focus on the necessity of upholding and strengthening the non-proliferation regime. So clearly in terms of deterring Iran, the United States, I think, will have, no question it will have that capacity. But then you have to look at the broader threats of proliferation on a regional basis, and the United States, I think, will want to, as a priority, continue to uphold the non-proliferation regime. And that means, again, we note in the report that very strong support for our allies means that those allies, in the end of the day, decide that they do not need to build up their own nuclear capabilities. So I think that, too, has been a point in the report that deserves a lot of attention.
Hi, William Chu, Japan Chair Fellow here at Hudson Institute. I have a comment and also a question. The comment is essentially the panel talked a lot about urgency and also allies. I would say that that's particularly noteworthy right now, given that we all have governments in Japan, Korea, Philippines, and Australia who are all mostly on board with the same concept that approach in terms of the threats and also the needs to sort of build up our defense capabilities. And I think we should make use of this window of opportunity when all of our allies and partners in regions are aligned. On the question, I do have a question on the industrial-based issue in terms of opportunities and also obstacles. In terms of and what it would look like, would opportunities consist of, because given, especially from a perspective of allies, in terms of they have a lot of the similar issues, does it entail, for instance, the Japanese building up, repair yards in Guam? Does it entail, we know about the Australian contribution to American submarine yards, the $3 billion to the United States. But does it also create other obstacles that we should be cognizant of, be it, say, cannibalizing their own capabilities for building up their own industrial bases or other sorts of obstructions? So if you guys can just talk about this a little bit, that'd be great.
I'll just, it's a great question. I mean, I would say we don't, not recalling very specific things to that point that we are making specific recommendations, but clearly that falls under the umbrella of why we think it's so important that the United States work very closely with allies. One thing that I tell, sort of apart from even the work of the Commission, I tell people is, if you are primarily concerned about the China threat versus the United States, we literally cannot win a long Cold War against the Chinese without our allies. We must have them for very, very, very practical reasons that you're laying out. They have advantages that we can cooperate with and take advantage of. We do have a nice section, small section, just showing our support for AUKUS in particular, but understanding that there are hurdles there for technology that we've got to get through to be able to share and collaborate more with the Australians in particular. So, all I really have to say is that it's a really great point, something that I think our diplomats really have to work for to see how can we do that better and what are the opportunities where we can take advantage of where the strengths are across the alliance.
So I would just add, it's a little bit broader. One of the things that we really focus on, and I'd mentioned it briefly, is greater coordination, integration, cooperation with allies. So in many respects, it's not just, well, allies can buy more in foreign military sales. That's not the point. The point really is much more integration, coordination, and planning in requirements, in interoperability of systems, joint development of systems. I mean, really looking at allies in a very different way, so that all of us together are able to confront whatever comes our way, and really to deter, because we are stronger when we are coordinated and focused together. So I would say infrastructure is important, but it's much more than that. It's research and development. It's the whole panoply.
And if I could just foot stomp the AUKUS point, which is lots of people focus on the submarines. Great, and we should. There's the technology piece, and it's the UK, is part of this as well. And so looking at how are we getting to really break down some of the barriers on technology, that most of the problem is the US, let's face it, right? We have a tendency to believe we've led on all these things, we have all the stuff everybody wants, and therefore we can protect whatever we want. That's not the world we live in today. And I think we are slowly coming around to realizing it. And I think, frankly, the fact that there was an AUKUS part of this at all is really, of the commission, is an indication that we see that this is an important part of where we need to go in terms of not just pillar one, but pillar two. How do we share technology amongst the 3 of the countries that are involved and named in AUKUS? But also, are there other countries that we need to look at, and how can other countries be a part of it? Is this a pathway? I don't know the answer, but I know there are a lot of people looking at it as in the US government right now, and I think it's something that we all, as the commission, thought was exactly the right thing to do, and to continue to see how we could proceed along that path, not just with the UK and Australia, but also with other allies. There's also one in the front row.
Hi, Tom Callender at General Dynamics. To kind of go back to the submarine piece and the recommendation for the third shipyard, understanding where we are with Columbia, right? We got rid of any little margin we had there, and we shifted by 2 years of Virginia in there. So do you think in that recommendation to kind of restart a third shipyard and the time it would take, do you think that really addresses the key problem, which are workforce, right? Right now, a demographic shift from an aging workforce, right now younger workforce, and trying to grow those at the current yards, and I think even more importantly, the supplier base, as well as the key issues with supplier base, critical suppliers and stuff like that Admiral Panos and others have talked about. Do you think a third shipyard wouldn't stress those more instead of kind of focusing in on some of those issues of kind of outsourcing more pieces, parts, than trying to do another whole shipyard? Thank you.
Yeah, no, we talked about that, and I'll having been the deputy under in the Navy Department, a lot of these issues are not new, Tom. The struggle to get welders is not new. But to your point, I think we discussed this at quite length, whether it was even feasible or would it be foolish to recommend that we pursue that third shipyard. And we came to the decision we must have the additional shipyard. It's got a lot of challenges, and it is not a viable solution if you haven't addressed the workforce problems across the supply chain. But we believe that we've got to do both.
Because it's going to take a long time to grow this workforce. I mean, one of our problems right now is we have a bit of a gap here. We have this sort of bimodal distribution, and there was one comment that said, well, what I really need is I need 15-year engineers, and I don't have them. I have 30-year engineers and I have 5-year engineers, but I don't have 15-year engineers. And I can take a 5-year engineer and put them in a position of a 15-year engineer, and we can pretend they're 15-year engineers, but they know they're not, and I know they're not, and they're just not going to perform like a 15-year engineer. And that's really the problem. It's, over the long term, we grow the 15-year engineers in the middle who will become 30-year engineers and help the 5-year engineers along. But it's not going to take, it isn't going to, a third shipyard, if it even happens, won't happen overnight. So the assumption is you have to do all these things in parallel.
Your report certainly focuses on hard weapons. Does it give much play to cybersecurity? So
we talked a little bit about cybersecurity. We talked about space systems. We talked about new technology. We also talked about command and control, not only of nuclear systems, but also of conventional systems, and making sure that all that was survivable. So we touch on it, and we talk about the importance of it. The real practical problem is so much of the cyber and so much of the space and so much of the command and control is classified that there's very little we could talk about in an unclassified report. Although we do mention the fact that we need both offensive and defensive space capabilities, that cyber is important, and also that these are one of the areas where we really need to partner with allies. Our allies have great capabilities across the board in all of these areas, and these are really, and they also happen to be located all over the world. So for a space capability or for a cyber capability, this is really important. But you know, we do have it. It's scattered throughout, but it's pretty narrow.
Many people don't realize that we're under daily attack in cybersecurity. Our federal systems, our federal contractor systems are constantly infused with malware that exfiltrates sensitive information.
Yep, and it's that, and it's also the sort of follow-on of electronic warfare. We talked about that a little bit too, you know, and the importance of that, and sort of reinvigorating how we think about that as well, which has a correlation. But again, it's hard to get into a lot of the details just because of the classification.
Got it. Masashi?
Thank you. I'm Masashi Murano, the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute. First, I'd like to respect the whole committee members and the support staff to involved in the preparation for this report. And I agree with that most of your analysis and recommendations and how I wish this report were an actual nuclear policy review. My question is about the time frame for reinforcing of the theater nuclear forces in Indo-Pacific region. Looking at the NATO, there is the DCA option, for example, but in Asia, there is no the B-61 depot, and also that the South Korea is too close from the North Korea. Japan is, of course, politically sensitive. Even its Guam is under the threat of the more than 500 DF-26s. And so that the number of the low-yield SLBM is very limited. So this is the reason why I strongly support of the sea-based option, and also that I disappointed that the Biden administration has been canceled the sea-launched cruise missile programs. So my question is, how many years do you think it will take to restart of the sea-launched cruise missile program or the operational deployment? Or have you considered about some alternative option of the Slackerman or something others? That's my question. Thank you.
So we don't specifically call for SLCM in or any other particular theater range capability. We do lay out the attributes that are desirable, but and I have the section right here in front of me. You know, but again, we use that word urgently. That we believe the U.S. theater nuclear force posture should be urgently modified in order to address the need for theater nuclear forces either deployed or based in the Asia-Pacific theater. It is in keeping with what Rose talked about in terms of how we reaffirm the crucial role of the NPT, that our allies feel that they are covered under our extended deterrent and that they have therefore no reason to pursue a nuclear capability of their own. And this is particularly true and of concern in the Asia-Pacific theater, but of course, with our friends in the Middle East and elsewhere as well.
We were tracking, as you know, events as they were going along, and I think, although it doesn't specifically appear as a recommendation in the report, but as I recollect our discussions, I think we were all quite positive about the statement with regard to extended deterrence that was reached with Seoul with ROK while the president was here for his summit meeting. That was all taking place as our discussions were going on. So I think it's just to underscore that we recognize the importance of that extended deterrence relationship in Asia as well as in NATO Europe. In NATO Europe, we've got a situation where the modernization of the B-6112 has now been completed, and dual-capable aircraft acquisitions are going on. So the F-35 acquisitions now, that issue has moved forward in a very positive way. So we were, I think, very positive about also attention to the extended deterrent in the Asia Pacific. And one thing we did discuss is how is it possible for perhaps some of the experience of the NATO European allies to be conveyed and to help bolster the experience of the allies in the Asia Pacific? Is there some, cooperation in exercises and training that could go on, for example? So we did a lot of discussion of these issues and talked about them quite a bit without, as I said, and as we've all been saying, picking winners or losers in this regard or recommending any particular program.
One other thing we mentioned, which should get some attention, is that I think we're fairly comfortable that U.S.-European Command exercises and understands how to do integrated nuclear conventional planning. I'm not sure we're as comfortable or confident in terms of U.S. Indo-PACOM, and therefore we urge, we ask that they ensure that integrated planning is conducted. You'll also find elsewhere in the report a discussion on revitalization of the nuclear planning group, increasing the number of exercises, the inclusion of non-nuclear allies in some of those exercises to the extent practicable, as reinforcing on the NATO side of the equation.
So just the follow-on, I mean, the one, we have several comments about the attributes, but one of them I just want to highlight is that they be forward deployed or deployable. So obviously on the deployed basis, that's up to a host country. That's a host country decision, and we don't make any recommendations about that. Other than, obviously, in Europe, we already have the B-6112s on their way. But it's important that we have those options, that they be forward deployed or deployable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the commissioners that are here today. Mark Newton from the British Embassy. I mean, I think the piece of work that you have done is incredibly important and shows how seriously you've been thinking about these issues. It's got a range of recommendations in there that are kind of absolutely, as you said, kind of necessary, and the work that needs to be done is vital. I'm conscious that the report is landing at a moment where there isn't a shortage of other news, and there is a risk, therefore, that it doesn't necessarily get the attention that the recommendations deserve. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you think the document has landed on the Hill, and whether there's more that others who support kind of things in it could be doing to make sure that people have read it and paid attention and are acting on the recommendations. Thank you.
So we had one hearing already last week with the Senate Armed Services Committee. We're tentatively planning another one with the House Armed Services Committee. I won't comment on the functionality of the House at the moment, but tentatively that's planned for the 15th of November, so we'll see how that works. But it is an issue. I mean, when we did our rollout date, we were very worried that the government might be shut down. We had no idea that, 4 days prior to our rollout, we'd have the conflict in Israel and Gaza. But it is important. I think we're going to try very hard forums like this. We also would like to identify other opportunities around the country, and I'll turn it back to you too. I mean, any opportunities that you see to get this report circulated, amongst British Embassy, amongst others, hosting roundtables with other allies, all of these things we're very much open to, because it's, first, it's a tough subject. The report is a little bit, as Rose has said in the past, hard-edged. And it's not a very comfortable recommendation where we find, or situation where we find ourselves. So I think you're absolutely right. Even if we didn't have all these extraneous things, I think it would also be hard to get this message out. But I think it's important. One of the things we call upon is various elected leaders to try and understand this report, try and take this report, and then talk about it as they go home to their districts. Try to socialize it a little bit.
Look, the 2009 Commission report didn't have a shelf life of 1 or 2 or 3 years. The recommendations they made were valid for many years. And the same will be true in this case. And the other thing that guarantees that these recommendations and the thought process that underpin them will remain front of mind is because Russia and China show no signs of stopping what they're doing, which is the threat that drove the consensus and the recommendations here. So I think the report we've produced, yes, while we have the situation in the House and so on and so forth with political campaigns, it will nevertheless remain relevant and I think of use to the defense establishment in particular for quite a few years.
I would also just say too, I was talking with a journalist a couple days ago about the report and how the report was going. And he said, it's just a shame that, understandably the world's attention is on what's going on with Israel and Gaza and what's about to happen there. And so it's sort of unrelated to the report. I'm like, no, it's directly related to the report. And so, I think as a commissioner, over the last year plus that we spent looking at the threats and looking how our adversaries are sometimes, and we talk about that there might be opportunistic aggression that might happen, what our adversaries might do to collaborate, exploit one another's, actions over here to do this. And so, I'm to the point where I think when I see things happening in the world, I'm like, oh my goodness, then this could happen, then this could happen. So, I think it really, what we're seeing now and with the Biden administration, I think appropriately rushing in other means of American hard power to deter other would-be aggressors, the Iranians obviously in particular with the THAAD battery, in addition to naval power, really underscores many of the big points in our report about limited numbers of these things that we need to be able to produce more of. And then also, Congress is going to be debating now weapons to provide to Ukraine, weapons to Israel, weapons to the Pacific, and our report. Those are all different. Many of those are different weapons packages, so I think we can do all three of those things. But it gets back to defense industrial base and the fact that the United States' ability to project power abroad is still based on our deterrent holding, our strategic deterrent holding. And so, I think it's all related. I think my commissioners would agree with that. But connecting those dots and explaining that in a way, I think, is, to Marshall's point too, everything we write in this report is going to be incredibly relevant for the foreseeable future, I think. There's a couple over, this one over here.
Komei Suzaki, another Japan chair fellow here. Thank you for the reports. Could you elaborate more about the financial and economic measures you wrote in the report? For example, do they include the counter-offensive or counter-strike capabilities, like selling bonds or devaluing their adversaries' currencies?
We don't go into depth on those kinds of topics, and as a matter of policy, the United States government does not attempt to manipulate currency or engage in such activities. But we do have a wide range of tools that are available that various presidents, really, I think we saw the strongest evolution of this begin in the Obama administration with the response to the seizure of Crimea. And a series of restrictions were then put on further investment in Russian oil and gas exploration, certain further restrictions on other types of investments that could be made. During the Trump administration, you saw an evolution of capability, particularly with regard to Iran, where a full suite of sanctions and other limitations and controls were placed causing a significant drop in Iranian oil production, a collapse in the Iranian currency as a result of these restrictions and so on. And then again, in the Biden administration, we've seen further efforts to impose consequences on Russia for its further aggression into Ukraine. What we are calling for is for the Department of Defense to help, not to step in and control, because they can't, it's not their tools, but to help the departments and agencies that have the export control responsibilities, like Commerce Department, Treasury, and state with sanctions authorities, to think through in a phased way, the same way we think through in a phased way for employment of kinetic force, to think through in a phased way the application of these various different tools over time in an effort, for instance, to deter Xi Jinping from thinking that he can conquer Taiwan. A major, major challenge, because while Russia's economy is the size of the state of Texas, China's economy is the second largest in the world, and the supply chains are so fully intertwined that many of the tools that we have available, we may find that we're unwilling to employ because we haven't done the hard thinking and planning in advance.
This is Kathy Scher from VOA. From the DoD's report last week, it shows China is exploring the development of conventionally armed intercontinental range missiles, and they're fielding the DF-53 and fielding the JL-3 to their Jing-class SSBN that can reach the continental U.S. So my question is, to strike the continental U.S., is that the strategy China has been focusing on and investing more resources in recent years? And does the U.S. have sufficient capability or defense system against those kind of weapons? Or does the U.S. have enough, whether conventional or nuclear weapons, to strike the mainland China when necessary as well? And second question is nuclear weapons. So how likely will China take advantage of this Ukraine war and Israel war to start a war in Taiwan or South China Sea? And if they use nuclear weapons, how likely will they abandon their public announced no first use policy and have this first strike? And what would be the U.S. solution in response to that? And sorry, last quick question is, what is your assessment on China's low-yield theater range nuclear weapons? And is it necessary to field the SLCMN in the Indo-Pacific? Thanks.
Do you want me to take a stab?
Go for Ms.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all very important, great questions. I mean, I would just say one of the things that the Commission grappled with is that China is rapidly investing in a variety of weapon systems. And that's that to write a report when things are moving is challenging. And that's why we looked at the trajectory that China was headed on and that trajectory it was on, to try to make recommendations to deal with that in particular trend. And then that's why we made the recommendations we made. I mean, I don't, do you want to talk about the specific point, the last points, Marshall, on theater or not?
Well, I mean, you know, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command has notified Congress that China now possesses more ICBM silos than we do. That's not to say that each silo is filled with a missile that has a warhead on it yet, but this is clearly evidence. And in the Commission report, which is consistent with the DoD report that was just issued, we actually lay out the unclassified numbers that we believe this trajectory probably represents, at least as best we understand it today. One of the recommendations that we make in the non-nuclear section of the report is that much more emphasis needs to be placed on certain conventional capabilities like hypersonics and like the conventional prompt strike type capabilities that the Navy is contemplating. We feel that there's probably not enough urgency being attached to the development and fielding of such capabilities, and we'd like to see an emphasis placed there on these medium-range cruise and ballistic capabilities, conventional.
Also the hypersonics, that was another area where we didn't see a sufficient lack of urgency was on the development of hypersonics. There's a corollary to your question that I think is important, and it's discussed a little. It is discussed in that report, but it's also a broader level of concern with respect to China, and that's the exfiltration of intellectual property across the board from the U.S. Both in defense contractors, from non-defense contractors, from universities and elsewhere. And that's something we really have to get serious about, is how to protect our technology. And I don't mean this in a sense that we have to not share, because we do have to share, but we have to make sure it isn't stolen. And we have to make sure that we preserve our economic and technological leadership, both in the U.S. and also with our allies. So this is another area. You had asked a little bit about some of the soft things. This is one of those soft things that I think we have to get much better at from a whole of government approach.
I'll say one more thing too, that the commission, we're not all China experts, Russia experts, North Korea experts, but we know that there's a lot we don't know about China's intentions. And so we spent a lot of time listening. We really sought out experts to try to understand the best we could to make the recommendations and findings we could. And just one of the things that obviously that about China is they're non-transparent. They are not sharing with the United States the direction they're going, but that's something that is a marked characteristic of their behavior, which makes it very, very difficult for the United States to do anything other than potentially prepare for what could possibly be worst case scenarios. And so that's certainly how strategists have to think about it. Anything else there? I think I guess maybe just let everybody hear. Do you have a quick one, sir? And then I guess I'll just take over here and then turn it over and let everybody just have a sort of a closing remark, and then we'll say goodbye.
Your last strategic report was 2009, and now you have one 2023. Why the long time gap?
Congress. These are statutorily directed, and in the same way that there was enough controversy that led to the statute in 2008 that then generated the commission in the 2009 report, that was a big inflection point. In other words, it looked like there was a lot of hope to be able to decrease, to have more cooperation, to have more agreements, to have long-term possibilities for overarching nuclear reductions. And now we're in the opposite inflection point. We tried to go down that road. The rest of the world didn't. And so now what do we do, right? They're all off increasing everything. And what's our future? What's our strategic posture look like? What is our force structure going to have to look like? So again, we had this inflection point. So it isn't the years. It's more situationally dependent.
But I will say, and I hope commissioners will quickly correct me if I'm wrong, this was not one party had Congress and one party was in the executive, right? In fact, this was done while actually all the houses in the executive were the same party. So it wasn't we need to catch you that you're doing something wrong. It was, in fact, a consensus of, we're at a point where we need to take another look at this.
I would just say, for my own sort of last sort of parting thoughts, was if you go through the report, some of our recommendations are not things that even require money. Some of them, it's political leadership, understanding, getting on the same page about the nature of the threat and what we're trying to do. One of our very specific recommendations is that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Energy establish the nuclear deterrence mission as the #1 priority in each of their departments' processes. And so it is getting on the same page and then bringing in things like Treasury so that we can use the tools that we have and make the best effort that we can make, and prioritize things properly and sequence them in a way that makes sense with the resources that we have. And so there's lots of things that we can do now that are incredibly doable and urgent and necessary.
I think my parting shot is a repeat of one of them that I said before, but we need to take actions today, not on everything that we've talked about in the report, but to enable choices to be made in the future. And if you don't take some decisions today or make some plans today and in the near term, you will constrain decision makers' ability to make correct decisions into the future.
I wanted to return to the question of how we keep this debate and discussion going. Your question, how do we get it out into a larger community? And I think it's really important first to repeat what the chair, Chairman Creedon, Vice Chair Kyle, and General John Hyten, who was also a commissioner, said during our rollout, which is read the report from beginning to end. There is a lot of detail and nuance in it, and you should really take it as a complete and whole document. Now, it's hard to take that out on the road and tell people to read the whole report, but I just want to say from my perspective, I will really welcome the opportunity over time to continue the discussion, to continue the debate, to take questions in, and to try to convey, first and foremost, the urgency of this matter.
We really tried to use straightforward language and to avoid Washington doublespeak in this report. It is, and we wordsmith every word.
A lot.
Every word in that report. So I do hope that you will read it. It's a discomforting read, but it is an easy read. It is very straightforward. It lays out the stakes, it lays out the threat, and everything that flows from that. So please do, to echo Rose's point, read it and promulgate it. Print it out and give it to your friends.
Yes.
Or send it to them.
Or email it to them.
However, I would recommend you read it online because on a somewhat lighter note, we apologize for the font. It's incredibly tiny. And so I would recommend you read it online so you don't go blind reading it. But a couple things also in here that are really serious recommendations. And there are several for the intelligence community and for DOD in the analysis side. We have spent so much time over the last couple decades focused on terrorism and the Middle East that among other things we have lost in our workforce is we have lost those analysts that truly understand China, that truly understand Russia, that truly understand their policies, their strategies, their thinking. And we need to get that back too. So that's another part of the importance of growing that workforce, because we do want to understand what drives our what drives our adversaries, what motivates them, because we don't ever want either the U.S. or allies or partners to take an action because we've misunderstood the action of an adversary. And the other couple things we talk about in terms of recommendations are really important, and certainly given what's going on in the Hill are somewhat timely. And that's this establishment needs consistent funding. We need regular budgets approved on a regular basis. CRs really hurt. They cost money, they add to the delay of the program. So one of the things we ask is for both the executive branch and Congress in particular to pass budgets on a timely basis and to have more flexibility in the funding and allow more advanced procurement. All of these things that Congress can do from a budgetary perspective, which is just managing the money. It's not necessarily providing more money, but managing the money so that the Defense Department and the Department of Energy can actually do things faster and more efficiently. But it's a good report, and as pretty much everybody has said when we started down this road, I was very skeptical that we would actually get here today, but it really is a testament to the commitment of the commissioners, and not only to consensus, but also to national security, that we could demonstrate this. So thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.